The crack of the jackhammer was a drumbeat of progress, shattering the brittle memory of summer days. A close-up shot of the turquoise-faded concrete, a network of hairline fractures like a shattered porcelain plate. The camera pulls back, revealing a gaping empty hole, the ghost of a swimming pool, now just a pit of exposed rebar and broken tile. The man, Mark, wipes sweat from his brow, a look of weary triumph on his face. He's free. A perfectly manicured lawn next door, a shadow falls over it, a siren in the distance. The sound is faint, then sharp, closer. The pristine lawn is marred by a frantic, designer-clad figure, her face a mask of furious disbelief, pointing a finger like a weapon. The camera pans to a police cruiser, red and blue lights flashing silently against the midday sun, its arrival a stark, surreal counterpoint to the quiet residential street. The woman screams, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated fury as she gestures wildly toward Mark's front gate. The smell of pulverized concrete and damp earth was a strange kind of perfume, a scent of new beginnings. For Mark, it was the smell of freedom. He stood on the edge of the crater, the former site of the backyard swimming pool, and felt a profound sense of relief. It had been an albatross around his neck for 5 years, an endless cycle of costly repairs, chemical treatments, and the quiet, seeping dread that came with a divorce settlement that left him with a house he could barely afford. The pool was a monument to a life that had ended, a life of 2 incomes and weekend barbecues that now felt like a distant, sepia-toned dream. "Look at all this space, Dad," Leo said, his voice small and awestruck. The 9-year-old was standing a few feet away, kicking a loose chunk of concrete. He was a skinny kid, all knees and elbows, with his mother's bright green eyes, which had always seemed to be looking for something Mark couldn't give him. "We could get a trampoline?" Mark smiled, a genuine, unforced smile. "We could get a basketball hoop, or maybe just a patch of grass. Grass is a lot cheaper to maintain than a pool, buddy." Leo seemed to consider this, a frown creasing his brow. "Did you tell Mrs. Gable we were taking it out?" The smile vanished from Mark's face. The mention of Sharon Gable was like a cold front moving in. "No, Leo, it's my pool, my yard, my decision." "She lets us use her pool sometimes," Leo said, a hint of concern in his voice. "Well, we won't need to anymore," Mark said, trying to keep the edge out of his voice. He loved his son fiercely, but the thought of Sharon Gable and her sense of entitlement made his blood pressure spike. Sharon was a force of nature in their little suburban enclave, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, and a woman who believed that the world and everyone in it existed for her convenience. When he'd first moved in with his ex-wife, Sharon had been their welcome wagon, a woman bearing a plate of artisanal cookies and a list of all the neighborhood rules, written in her own neat, cursive hand. She'd always been possessive of their collective amenities, and for a while, she'd treated his pool as an extension of her own. Her twin daughters, perfectly coiffed and perpetually bored, had spent countless summer afternoons splashing in his water, their laughter echoing across the manicured lawns. Mark knew this wouldn't be easy. The crew had started yesterday, and he'd already seen her peering over her 6-foot privacy fence, her binoculars trained on his yard. It was only a matter of time. He just hadn't expected it to escalate so quickly. The first volley came that evening, a text message that pinged on his phone just as he was sitting down to a dinner of reheated pizza with Leo. "Mark, I am absolutely stunned. We need to talk. You can't just do this." He considered ignoring it, but he knew that would only make her more aggressive. He took a deep breath and typed out a short, simple response. "Sharon, the pool was a liability. It's a financial decision. The crew will be done by Friday." The response was immediate. A phone call. Mark let it go to voicemail, watching as a text balloon popped up with a transcription of her message. You have a responsibility to this community, Mark, the property values, the neighborhood aesthetic, the kids. We had an arrangement. You let us use the pool, and in return, I didn't report you to the HOA for that god-awful garden gnome. This is a betrayal. Call me back right now. Mark ran a hand through his hair, the pizza forgotten. The gnome. An old, beat-up ceramic gnome. His ex-wife had loved, now standing watch over his perpetually half-dead rose bushes. Sharon had always hated it, a tiny, kitschy symbol of everything she considered gauche and low class. He had left it there out of a stubborn sense of defiance. The arrangement she spoke of was, in reality, a one-sided negotiation where she had tacitly agreed not to complain about his gnome in exchange for unlimited access to his pool. He hadn't even realized he was a party to it. Leo watched him, his brow furrowed in a way that made Mark's heart ache. Is she mad about the trampoline? She's mad about the pool, buddy, Mark said, trying to muster a confident smile. It's fine. It's my house. She'll get over it. But she didn't. The next morning, the crew was back, and Sharon was waiting for them. She stood at the edge of his property line, arms crossed over a crisp white button-down shirt, a look of righteous indignation on her face. She cornered the lead contractor, a no-nonsense man named Dave with a perpetually tired expression. Mark watched from his kitchen window as she gesticulated wildly, her voice carrying across the quiet street. He couldn't make out the words, but he knew the tone. It was a sound he'd come to know well, the sound of Sharon Gable on a mission, to correct a perceived injustice. He went outside, his boots crunching on the gravel the crew had laid down. Everything all right, Dave? Dave, a man who had seen it all, just shook his head. She's asking about permits. Says you need an inspection before you can remove a structure like this. Says she's a representative of the HOA and needs to see the paperwork. Mark turned to Sharon. I have all the necessary permits, Sharon. They're on file with the city, and you are not a representative of the HOA. That position is elected. You're a member, just like I am. Sharon's face, usually so composed, was starting to get splotchy. This is a violation of the covenant. You're creating an eyesore. And what about the kids, the community? You're robbing our children of a shared resource. It was never a shared resource, Sharon, Mark said, his voice low and firm. It was a private pool, my private pool. And I'm sorry, but I can't afford it anymore. I need to sell the house eventually, and the pool is a money pit. The maintenance alone is bankrupting me. The words felt like a confession, a flash of weakness that he immediately regretted. He shouldn't have to explain his financial situation. To her. Her expression hardened, morphing from indignation to something more sinister. Well, I guess some people just can't keep up with the demands of living in a respectable neighborhood. This is a mess, Mark, a dangerous mess. What if a child falls in? What if the exposed wires cause a fire? You've created a liability, and I'm not going to stand by while you jeopardize our property values. The electricity has been shut off, Mark said, his voice tight. The hole is covered with a tarp at the end of the day. It's perfectly safe. For now, she said, her voice a poisonous whisper. But you can't be trusted. You'll regret this. She turned and stalked back to her house, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair bouncing with each angry step. Mark watched her go, a sense of unease settling in his gut. He knew that threat wasn't an idle one. He'd seen her work before, a master of passive-aggressive retribution. He'd seen her rally the neighborhood against a couple who had painted their front door a shade of yellow she deemed unacceptable. He'd watched her systematically get a family's beloved basketball hoop removed from their driveway, citing a long-forgotten HOA rule. She was relentless, a shark sensing blood in the water. The rest of the day was quiet. The jackhammer worked, in its rhythm. And Mark tried to get some work done on his laptop, but he couldn't concentrate. He kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see Sharon peering over the fence. He felt like he was living in a surveillance state, a feeling that only intensified when he got a third email from her, this time with the subject line, "Formal Complaint." The email was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive rhetoric, a carefully worded legalistic threat. She cited Section 4, subsection C of the HOA bylaws, which she claimed requires a consistent aesthetic and property maintenance plan that maintains or enhances the collective property value of the neighborhood. She also mentioned potential public nuisance and unsafe conditions for neighborhood children. It was all a complete fabrication, a flimsy excuse for her to get her way, but it had the teeth of a legal document. She signed off with a curt, "I will be pursuing this matter to the full extent of my authority as a concerned homeowner." Mark laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. He had just about had it. He was a good man, a hard-working single father who was just trying to do the right thing for his family. The pool was a luxury he couldn't afford, a constant reminder of a life he had lost. Removing it was an act of survival, not an act of malice. He pulled out his own copy of the HOA bylaws, a thick pamphlet he hadn't looked at in years, and started flipping through it. He found the sections she was referencing and saw, as he suspected, that she had twisted them to fit her narrative. The consistent aesthetic clause applied to new construction and major renovations, not the removal of an excess. Sergeant Miller's voice, a calm and steady current in the hurricane of Sharon Gable's fury, was the only thing that kept Mark from completely losing his composure. "He'll be here shortly, Mr. Turner. We just need you to stand by." Mark nodded, but he could feel the cold dread gripping his stomach. Sharon, meanwhile, had backed away a few paces, her arms now crossed defiantly, a thin, triumphant smile on her lips. She was a cat who had just cornered her prey, a predator in a pristine suburban habitat. He wanted to scream at her, to ask her why she was doing this, but he knew it would be pointless. She wasn't seeking a resolution, she was seeking a victory. 10 minutes later, a white city-issued sedan with a faded logo on the door pulled up. A man in a high-visibility vest stepped out, carrying a clipboard. He was a stocky, no-nonsense man with a thick mustache that seemed to droop with the weight of years of bureaucratic battles. This was Leonard Finch, a city inspector. He didn't even glance at Sharon, who immediately tried to intercept him, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as she began to detail her concerns. Leonard held up a hand. "Let's just look, ma'am. That's what I'm here for." He strode purposefully past her, his gaze scanning Mark's yard, taking in the pit of dirt and gravel, the stacks of broken concrete, and the temporary tarp that covered the deepest part of the crater. Mark followed him, trying to make his case without sounding defensive. "I have all the necessary permits, sir. They're on file at City Hall. I can show you copies." "We'll get to that," Leonard said, his voice a low rumble. He walked to the edge of the pit, peered down, and then ran his boot through a small pile of excavated soil. Sharon, meanwhile, was circling the perimeter like a nervous hawk, pointing and muttering, her voice a low, constant buzzing in the air. "See that?" she said, pointing to a small exposed section of pipe near the edge. "That's the water main. He's compromised it. He's going to flood the street." Leonard didn't even look up. He took a small shovel from his truck, dug a bit deeper, and then pulled out a small bent section of copper pipe. He held it up. "This, ma'am, is a section of the old pool's circulation pipe. It's completely disconnected from the city's water infrastructure. It's inert." Sharon's face fell, but only for a second. She quickly pivoted. "What about the structural integrity? He's destabilized the foundation. He's going to cause a sinkhole." Leonard sighed, a puff of tired air. He walked a few feet further into the yard, knelt, and ran a small metal detector over the ground. It made a series of quick, quiet beeps. He stood up, dusted off his knees, and turned to Sharon, his expression completely blank. "The foundation of the house is approximately 20 feet from the edge of the excavation. The pool was on a separate, concrete slab. There is no evidence of structural destabilization. The ground is packed and stable. Sharon's composure was beginning to crack. Her voice, which had been so full of venom, was now thin and reedy. What about the wires? The live electrical wires. My children could have been electrocuted. Leonard pointed to a small, capped-off junction box near the house, a few feet from the old pool site. The electrical has been professionally disconnected and capped. It's up to code. It's also completely turned off at the breaker. He finally looked at her directly. Ma'am, everything here is in full compliance. He's got the right permits, the work is being done by a licensed contractor, and the site is secured at the end of each day. There are no public safety hazards, no structural issues, and no violations of the city code. He turned to Mark. Mr. Turner, I'm going to file my report. You're clear. You can continue the work. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of respect. Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him, so powerful it almost made his knees buckle. He was vindicated. He was in the clear. He turned to look at Sharon, his face a mixture of relief and a quiet, weary anger. Sharon's triumphant smirk had completely vanished. Her face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. But, the covenants. What about the aesthetic? The property values? This is unacceptable. This is a blatant disregard for the rules. Sergeant Miller stepped forward, her hand on Sharon's arm. Ma'am, the covenants and the HOA are not a police matter. That's a civil issue. You're done here. Go home. Sharon ripped her arm away from the officer's grasp. This isn't over. This is a disgrace. I know people. The mayor. The city council. I'll see to it that you lose your job. Her voice rose to a shrill, piercing scream. You will regret this, Mark. You will regret the day you ever came to this neighborhood. She then turned, and for the first time, Mark saw her in a moment of pure, unadulterated defeat as she stormed back into her perfectly manicured house, slamming the door behind her with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. The police officers, after a few final, weary words with Leonard, also drove away, their silent lights fading into the twilight. Mark stood alone in his yard, the sound of crickets slowly returning to the quiet suburban street. The relief he felt was fleeting. He had won the battle, but he knew the war was far from over. Sharon's parting words, a venomous personal attack, had lodged themselves deep in his mind. He wasn't just a neighbor who had annoyed her anymore. He was a target. Over. The next few days, the work continued. The hole was filled in, the ground was leveled, and the debris was hauled away. He was able to get a small, fresh layer of topsoil, and new sod was being delivered next week. The backyard was transforming into a blank canvas, a place for new memories. Mark tried to put the incident behind him, to focus on the future. Leo was excited about the prospect of a basketball hoop and a green lawn. They could finally have a catch without the risk of a ball ending up in a murky pool. But the tension was a physical presence, a constant pressure in the air. He felt Sharon's eyes on him whenever he was outside. He saw her car slow down just a little bit too much as she drove by. He was a ghost in his own neighborhood, a pariah in her self-created kingdom. Then the second volley came, and it was far more insidious than the first. It wasn't about the pool this time. It was about Leo. It started with a call from the principal of Leo's elementary school. Mark had been expecting a call about a field trip or an upcoming parent-teacher conference, but the principal's voice was different, formal, guarded. Mr. Turner, I'm calling about Leo. We received a report today from a concerned community member. They've raised some very serious allegations about the home environment. Specifically, they've claimed that there are unsafe conditions at your residence, stating that the removal of your swimming pool has created a hazardous, unsecured pit in your backyard, and that you have been verbally aggressive and unstable in front of your son. Mark's blood ran cold. He felt the world tilt on its axis. He didn't even need to ask who the concerned community member was. It was Sharon. He could hear her voice, twisting his words, weaponizing his frustration, fabricating a narrative of neglect and danger. "Sir, that's not true," Mark said, his voice a desperate whisper. "The pit is filled in. It's safe. The city inspector just cleared everything, and I would never be verbally aggressive in front of my son. He is my entire world." "I understand, Mr. Turner," the principal said, his voice softening just a bit. "But these are serious claims. Because they involve a minor, and because they've been made in writing and forwarded to the school board, we're required to follow up with a formal wellness check. We've already contacted Child Protective Services. They will be in touch with you shortly." The phone felt heavy in his hand, a dead weight. The city inspector's report meant nothing now. Sharon hadn't given up. She had just shifted her strategy. She had moved her battlefield from his yard to his son's school, from property, values to his fitness as a parent. The stakes had been raised to an unimaginable level. He was no longer just fighting for his right to a backyard. He was fighting for his son. And as he looked out his window, he saw Sharon Gable's face, pale and smug, watching him from her dining room window, a silent, knowing victor in a war she had just begun. The phone slipped from Mark's hand and clattered onto the kitchen table, the dial tone a shrill, mocking sound in the sudden silence. His heart hammered against his ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. A wellness check. Child Protective Services. Sharon hadn't just filed a complaint. She had weaponized her malice, aiming it directly at the most vulnerable part of his life. His son. The thought made his vision blur with a white-hot rage, a fury so intense it made the air in the room feel thin and metallic. Leo, completely oblivious to the storm that had just descended upon their small, quiet home, was in the living room, humming to himself as he worked on a Lego castle. Mark walked in, forcing a smile that felt brittle and foreign on his face. He knelt down next to his son, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "Hey, buddy. Everything okay?" Leo looked up, his green eyes sparkling. "Yeah, I almost finished the portcullis." He held up a small, intricately built gate. "It goes up and down." Mark just looked at him, at the innocence and joy radiating from his son, and a wave of protectiveness so fierce it was almost painful washed over him. He would not let Sharon Gable take this from them. He would not let her poison their home, their lives, with her toxic cruelty. He would fight for Leo with everything he had. The rest of the evening was a blur of frantic phone calls and a simmering, controlled panic. He called his ex-wife Sarah, who, despite their acrimonious split, was instantly enraged by the news. "She did what?" Sarah's voice was a low growl of disbelief. "I'll call my lawyer. I'll call the school board." "This is insane, Mark. You need to fight this. You can't let her get away with this." "I know," Mark said, his voice raw. "But what do I do? What do I say?" "You get your paperwork together. You have the city inspector's report, right? That's your first line of defense. And you tell the social worker exactly what's happening. You tell them about the pool, the police, the lies. You make it clear that this is a retaliatory attack from a vindictive neighbor." Mark hung up with a fresh sense of purpose. He wasn't alone in this. He had the city inspector's report, a formal document that debunked all of Sharon's initial claims. He had Leo, his bright, happy son, a living testament to his competence as a father. And now he had Sarah, a fierce, protective ally who, despite their differences, would never let anyone hurt their son. The social worker, a woman named Ms. Henderson, arrived the next morning. She was a woman in her late 40s with kind, tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She was quiet, professional, and took meticulous notes. Mark showed her the house, every room, every corner. He showed her Leo's clean, well-stocked room, the full pantry, the organized bills on the desk. He then led her to the backyard, to the newly leveled earth that was now a blank canvas, not a hazardous, unsecured pit. He handed her the city inspector's report, a small victory he was now leaning on with the full weight of his hope. Ms. Henderson read it carefully, her lips pursed in thought. So the city found no violations. None, Mark said, his voice firm. The work was up to code. I had the permits and the site was secure. Everything she alleged was a lie. And the verbal aggression? She asked, her pen hovering over her notepad. Ms. Henderson, I was frustrated. I just had 2 police officers show up at my gate based on her baseless complaints. I told her I was tired of her bullying. I never raised my voice at my son. I'm a single father. I'm trying to make ends meet, and she has been relentlessly trying to make my life miserable since I decided to remove a pool I couldn't afford to maintain. This isn't about my son's welfare. This is about revenge, Ms. Henderson nodded slowly, but her expression remained guarded. We'll need to speak with Leo, of course. Just a few questions. Mark's heart sank, but he knew this was coming. He brought Leo in from the living room, and the social worker spoke, to him with a gentle, reassuring tone. She asked him about his life, his school, his dad. Leo, a naturally talkative kid, answered honestly and with his usual enthusiasm. He told her about the basketball hoop they were going to get and the trampoline they could get one day. He told her his dad made the best scrambled eggs in the world. He said he loved living with his dad. It was a beautiful, honest performance, and Mark's chest swelled with pride. As Ms. Henderson was packing up her things, the doorbell rang. Mark's heart leapt into his throat. He knew it could only be one person. He opened the door to find Sharon Gable standing on his front porch, a tight saccharine smile plastered on her face. She was holding a Tupperware container with a few sad-looking brownies inside. "Mark, darling," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I just heard you were having some visitors. I wanted to make sure everything was okay. It's been so stressful for you, what with all the changes." She peered past him, her eyes darting to Ms. Henderson, a look of faux concern on her face. "Oh, hello there. I'm Sharon Gable. We're neighbors. I just happened to be passing by and saw you." The look Ms. Henderson gave Sharon was one of pure professional skepticism. She was a social worker, a person who had spent her career dealing with people who lied, manipulated, and feigned concern. Sharon's performance was so transparently fake it was almost comical. "Ma'am, do you have any reason to believe that this child is in danger?" Ms. Henderson asked, her voice calm and steady. Sharon, caught off guard by the directness of the question, stammered. "Well, I wouldn't say danger exactly, but Mark has been so unstable since the pool and the pit. It was just so hazardous. And he's so short-tempered. I'm just a concerned community member doing my due diligence for the children, you know. Mr. Turner has provided me with a city inspector's report that states the yard is up to code and presents no hazards," Ms. Henderson said, her voice like ice. "He's also provided me with a detailed account of your recent complaints. It seems you have a history of disputes with your neighbor. Is that correct?" Sharon's face, a second ago so full of forced sympathy, now went white. The kind, professional facade of the social worker was cracking, revealing a steel core of authority. I don't know what you're talking about," Sharon said, her voice now high and thin. "I'm just a concerned neighbor. I just want what's best for the community." "Ma'am, I understand you're concerned," Ms. Henderson said, her voice now completely devoid of warmth. "But as it stands, your statements appear to be unsubstantiated. Making false reports to Child Protective Services is a serious matter. I will be filing my report, and I will be noting your attempts to interfere with this investigation. Good day." She turned and left, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Mark closed the door on Sharon's stunned, furious face. The brownies were still in her hand, a pathetic, discarded offering. He felt a surge of triumph, a rush of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. He had won, again. But the win felt hollow. It didn't stop her. She was relentless. He couldn't keep fighting her on her terms, reacting to every new, insane volley she launched. He needed to get ahead of her, to disarm her, to find her weakness. He started by doing something he never did. He talked to his neighbors. He knocked on the door of an older couple, the Millers, who had lived on the street for 30 years. He explained what was happening, expecting them to be sympathetic but unwilling to get involved. To his surprise, the woman, a kind grandmotherly figure named Mrs. Miller, invited him in. "We know about Sharon," she said, her voice hushed. "We've all dealt with her. She's a bully. She gets a bee in her bonnet about something, and she won't let go." She told him stories of Sharon's campaigns. The time she tried to get a couple with a new baby to remove their security camera, citing a privacy violation. The time she rallied the neighborhood to complain about a family's dog, a perfectly well-behaved golden retriever, saying it was a nuisance. Sharon was a master of manufactured outrage. "But what about the HOA?" Mark asked. "She keeps claiming she's the authority on the covenants." "She's not," Mrs. Miller said. "She tried to run for president once. She lost. Badly. She's just a member, like you and me. But she's so loud and so insistent that everyone just lets her get away with it. No one wants the headache." Mark's mind was racing. He wasn't dealing with a legal authority. He was dealing with a woman who had a habit of bluffing, of using intimidation to get her way. She wasn't a queen. She was a loud, entitled citizen who had everyone convinced she wore a crown. Then Mrs. Miller said something that made his blood run cold. "She also has a history with the school. You know, when the Smiths moved in a few years ago, they had a son who was a little wild, a bit of a troublemaker. Sharon hated him. She called the school, the police, even child services, said he was a menace. But the Smiths had her on camera. She was harassing them. They had to get a restraining order. It all got swept under the rug, but it happened." Mark felt a jolt of understanding. Sharon wasn't just a bully. She was a repeat offender. She had a pattern, a history of this kind of behavior. He could fight this. He could win. He just needed to find the proof. He needed to find the Smiths. He went home, his mind ablaze with a new kind of purpose. He wasn't scared anymore. He was angry, and his anger was fueling a cold, hard determination. He spent the next few hours online, searching for Smith family and their old address. It took him a while, but he finally found them. They had moved to the next town over, just a short drive away. He had to take a chance. He had to see. The dossier was a physical thing, a heavy weight on Mark's kitchen table. It wasn't a binder full of accusations. It was a testament to Sharon Gable's malice, a timeline of her campaigns of intimidation and harassment. Inside were his own. Notes from the police visit and the social worker's inquiry, the city inspector's report that vindicated him, and the formal documents from the Smiths and the Johnsons, police reports, legal letters, and copies of restraining orders. The combined evidence painted a picture not of a concerned neighbor, but of a vindictive and serial harasser. He spent the evening organizing it all, his mind a steel trap of facts and dates. He was no longer running from a predator. He was preparing a case. The fear had been replaced by a quiet, burning determination. This wasn't about a pool or a garden gnome anymore. This was about his right to live in peace, to raise his son without the constant threat of a fabricated crisis. This was about justice. The day of the monthly HOA meeting dawned with a crisp, autumn chill in the air. The meeting was held in the small community center at the end of their street, a bland, beige room with uncomfortable folding chairs and a long table at the front for the board members. Mark arrived early, the heavy folder of evidence in his hand, a physical manifestation of his resolve. He found a seat in the back, a strategic position to observe the room. The other neighbors filtered in slowly, a collection of faces Mark now saw with a new, knowing eye. He saw the Millers, who gave him a small, conspiratorial nod. He saw others who had likely been victims of Sharon's petty tyrannies. Their faces, a mix of resignation and quiet curiosity. Then she arrived. Sharon Gable, a vision in a perfectly tailored pantsuit, her blonde hair coiffed into a pristine helmet. She walked with a confident swagger, a woman who owned the room before she even sat down. She took her seat at the front table, next to George, the timid HOA president, and gave a tight, superior smile to the rest of the room. She was a queen returning to her throne, oblivious to the rebellion brewing in the shadows. The meeting started with the usual mundane reports, the budget for the new landscaping, a discussion about the winter holiday decorations. Mark barely heard a word. He was focused on Sharon, on the way she held herself, the way she would lean in and whisper something to George, a quick, dismissive gesture that showed her complete control. Finally, George cleared his throat, his face pale. Okay, next on the agenda is a homeowner complaint. He glanced nervously at Sharon, who gave him a sharp, warning look. Mark Turner, about his pool removal. Mark, you have the floor. Mark stood up, his folder in his hand. The room went quiet. He walked to the front of the room, standing at a small podium, facing everyone. He didn't look at Sharon. He spoke directly to the room, his voice calm and measured. Thank you, George. I'm here tonight to talk about a pattern of harassment I've experienced since I began the process of removing my pool. What started as a simple disagreement has escalated into a series of false allegations to the police, the city, and even Child Protective Services. A murmur went through the room. Sharon, her smile now gone, leaned forward. This is ridiculous, Mark. You're misrepresenting the situation. I was simply concerned about the neighborhood aesthetic and the safety of our children. Mark didn't miss a beat. He opened his folder. I have here a copy of the city inspector's report, which was filed after Ms. Gable called the police and claimed my property was a public nuisance. The report states in no uncertain terms that the work was up to code, all permits were in order, and the site was completely safe. He held up the report. So, Ms. Gable's claims of a public safety hazard were, in fact, false. Sharon's face went scarlet. That's not the whole story. You were hostile. You were aggressive. I was frustrated, Mark said, his voice rising slightly, because you had 2 police officers show up at my gate, and I have here the report from Child Protective Services, which was filed after you, Ms. Gable, called the school and made false claims of an unsafe home environment and verbal aggression towards my son. The social worker, after a full investigation, found all of your claims to be unsubstantiated and noted that you, Ms. Gable, attempted to interfere with her investigation. He looked at the room, at the stunned faces of his neighbors. This wasn't a he said, she said anymore. This was documented, official evidence. He was laying out her lies, one by one. Sharon was speechless, a rare thing for her. She just sat there, her mouth open slightly, her eyes wide with a look of dawning terror. But this isn't an isolated incident, Mark continued, his voice now a low, powerful rumble. This is a pattern of harassment, of using the HOA as a weapon, of fabricating accusations to get your way. He looked at Mrs. Miller, who nodded her encouragement. A few years ago, a family named the Smiths moved into this neighborhood. They had a son who Ms. Gable didn't like. She harassed them relentlessly. She filed false police reports. She called the school, just like she did with my family. And eventually, the Smiths were forced to get a restraining order against her. The room erupted in a stunned gasp. People were whispering, turning to look at Sharon, their eyes full of a mixture of shock and disgust. Sharon finally found her voice, a shrill, hysterical sound. This is slander. This is a lie. I have no idea who the Smiths are. Mark held up the restraining order, a certified legal document. This is a copy of the restraining order dated 5 years ago. It's a matter of public record. And to prove this isn't a one-off, I also spoke to a family named the Johnsons, who were here before the Smiths. They also had a restraining order filed against Ms. Gable for a similar pattern of harassment. He looked directly at her for the first time that night. Her mask of composure was completely shattered. She was trembling, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were white. Her face was no longer red with anger, but with shame and a primal, terrifying fear. "So, to be clear," Mark said, his voice hard as steel, "Ms. Gable didn't just object to my pool. She has a history of targeting her neighbors, of using false reports and intimidation to get her way. She tried to get me in trouble with the police, with the city, and with Child Protective Services. And I'm here tonight to ask the HOA to take formal action against her. This behavior cannot be tolerated. We need to send a clear message that this neighborhood is a community, not a kingdom for one person's petty tyrannies." George, the timid HOA president, looked at the folder, then at Sharon, who was now staring down at the table, a puddle of defeated fury. He had a choice to make, a moment of truth that would define his time in office. He took a deep breath. "This is a lot to take in. I believe we need to make a motion." Another board member, a quiet man who had always seemed to be in Sharon's shadow, spoke up. "I move that we issue a formal censure of Ms. Gable's behavior and remove this or her from her position on the Architectural Review Committee, and that we issue a formal warning that any further harassment, as defined by this evidence, will result in her being permanently banned from all HOA meetings and functions." The motion was seconded. The vote was unanimous. Sharon Gable had lost her crown, but Mark wasn't finished. As the murmurs of the room died down, he looked at Sharon one last time, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "One last thing," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "The Smiths and the Johnsons weren't the only ones who filed legal documents against her. I will be using all of this evidence to file a formal civil suit for harassment and emotional distress. I'm also filing for a legal injunction to protect me and my son from any further contact with her. The next time she tries to harass me, it won't be a call to the police. It'll be a call to my lawyer, and it will have real consequences." Sharon Gable finally looked up, her eyes wide with a desperate, terrified plea. But there was no sympathy in the room, no one to come to her defense. She had spent years building a kingdom of fear, and in one evening, it had all come crashing down. She stood up slowly, her body trembling, and walked out of the room, not a queen, but a pariah, leaving behind a silence that was more powerful than any of her screams. Mark stood at the front of the room, a new hero in his own neighborhood. The neighbors were now looking at him with respect, with a sense of gratitude and relief. The power dynamic had shifted completely. He had stood up for himself, and in doing so, he had given the rest of the community a voice. He gathered his folder, a triumphant weight in his hands, and walked out into the cool night air. The community center was no longer a place of bland meetings. It was a place where justice had finally been served. The silence in the aftermath of the HOA meeting was more potent than any of Sharon Gable's screams. It was the silence of a battle won, a kingdom toppled, a community liberated. Mark walked out into the cool night air, the heavy folder of evidence, feeling light as a feather in his hands. He had come here as a target, a man fighting for his family's survival. He was leaving as a victor, a hero in a quiet suburban war. He drove home, a sense of profound peace settling over him. He wasn't just safe. He was free from the constant anxiety, the relentless surveillance, the fear of the next attack. The garage door rumbled open, and he pulled his car into the familiar space, a place that now felt completely and unequivocally his own. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. The air was lighter. He was no longer a ghost in his own enclave. People waved to him as he got his mail. A few even stopped to thank him, their voices hushed with a mixture of gratitude and relief. "It was about time someone stood up to her," an older woman named Carol said, her voice trembling slightly. "She's made our lives a living hell for years." Mark realized he hadn't just fought his own battle, he had fought theirs too. But the real battle was yet to come. The HOA meeting was a public shaming, a loss of her title and her power. The real consequences would come from the civil suit. Mark had his lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Angela, on speed dial. He handed her the entire dossier, the collection of evidence that painted a portrait of a serial harasser. Angela's reaction was one of grim satisfaction. "This is a gold mine, Mark. The police reports, the CPS report, and especially those restraining orders. This is a slam dunk. We're not just going to get a legal injunction, we're going to hit her with a suit for harassment and emotional distress. We're going to make sure she never bothers you or your son again." The legal process moved swiftly. The restraining order was filed and approved, a formal piece of paper that stated, in no uncertain terms, that Sharon Gable was not to contact Mark or his son, either directly or indirectly, in person, by phone, or by email. It was a shield, a protective barrier that felt more comforting than any fence or security system. The lawsuit was a different beast. It was a statement, a final resounding echo of a war that had been fought and won. Mark wasn't looking for a large sum of money. He was looking for a lesson in consequences, a lesson that actions have repercussions, and that you can't bully people without paying a price. The real-world consequences for Sharon were swift and brutal. She had been the undisputed queen of the neighborhood, and now she was a pariah. Her friends, the ones who had tacitly supported her or simply been too scared to stand up to her, now crossed the street when they saw her. She was no longer invited to the neighborhood book club or the morning coffee clutches. The phone calls stopped. The emails stopped. The only interaction she had with her neighbors was the cold, silent disapproval of a community that had finally seen her for who she truly was. Her kingdom had not just been toppled, it had been erased. One afternoon, Mark was in his backyard, finally laying the new sod. The lawn was coming to life, a fresh, vibrant green carpet that filled the crater where the pool had once been. Leo, his face flushed with excitement, was helping him, his small hands carefully pressing the sod into place. The basketball hoop had been ordered and was on its way. The backyard, once a source of financial stress and constant worry, was now a place of hope and new beginnings. He heard the distant rumbling of a lawnmower, and he looked up. Across the street in her perfectly manicured yard, Sharon Gable was cutting her own grass. It was a strange sight. She always had a professional crew to handle her landscaping. She was alone, her face pale, her movements jerky and unsure. She was an amateur at this kind of work, and it showed. The lines were uneven, the pace was slow. She was out there by herself, a woman who had once commanded a small army of contractors and service workers, now reduced to a solitary, mundane task. It was a picture of a woman whose world had shrunk to the size of her own yard, a woman who no longer had an audience for her performance. He had a moment of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. The victory wasn't in the lawsuit or the restraining order. It was in this small, quiet moment. It was in seeing the tyrant reduced to a mere person, alone, defeated, and without an audience. As he was finishing up for the day, he saw her, standing at the edge of her property line, her eyes on him. She wasn't angry this time. She wasn't screaming. She just stood there, a small, solitary figure, her face a mask of what looked like regret? No, not regret, something colder. It was the look of a woman who had lost everything she valued. He finished laying the last piece of sod, dusted off his knees, and stood up straight. He looked at his son, who was laughing as he chased a rogue cricket across the new lawn. He looked at his yard, a place of peace and joy. He looked at Sharon Gable, a woman who had tried to take it all away. He didn't feel rage or animosity, he just felt pity. He turned his back on her, a final, definitive gesture of dismissal. He walked into his house, his son running ahead of him, and closed the door behind them. The next time he looked out his kitchen window, her yard was empty. The sound of the lawnmower was gone. He never saw her again. She sold her house a few weeks later, quietly, without a word to anyone. A different family moved in, a young couple with 2 small children, a friendly golden retriever, and a big, beautiful trampoline in the backyard. They brought over a plate of cookies, and Mark, for the first time in a long time, genuinely smiled.